Welcome back to our afternoon and evening session. So we will have two speakers coming up. First of all, sort of discussing the AI and democratic values will be Renbin Dixon. Renbin graduated with her master's from the Humphrey School. And she specializes in AI governance. She is a research fellow at the Center for AI and Digital Policy, where she works on policy guidance that can help governments, multilateral organizations, and coming up with responses to AI. And so she'll be specifically discussing this democratic values and AI index that the center has put together. Thanks very much.
Testing, is this good? Is the sound on? Perfect, all right. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, James, and to DSI for this opportunity to share the work that we do at the Center for AI and Digital Policy. Right, so today I will be presenting the report, Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Value, the AIDV report. But before I dive into that, I just want to give a brief background on the Center for AI and Digital Policy, followed by the background of the report itself. And then next I'll walk through the KDIP index and the key findings. And then to conclude, I will share some of the KDIP policy recommendations. So the Center for AI and Digital Policy is a global, independent, nonprofit organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. Through education and research, our mission is to ensure that AI policy and digital policy promotes a society that is more fair, more just, and more accountable. A world where technology upholds fundamental rights, democratic institution, and the rule of law. So one of the things that we do is also to provide expert guidance to governments, to international organizations, including the UNESCO, OECD, Council of Europe, G7, G20, and the European Parliament. And one of our key work, which is what I'll be presenting today, is in publishing the Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Value Report. The AIDV report is one of the most comprehensive review of AI policies and practices worldwide. So a bit of background, the first report was published in 2021. At that time, we assessed 30 countries and was produced by 23 contributors. This year, we published our 5th edition. This time, we assessed 80 countries, and our research team consisted of over 1,000 researchers, representing more than 100 countries. The report itself is more than 1,500 pages and over 7,000 footnotes. But one of the key output from this report is the KDIP index, which evaluates countries' alignment with democratic values using 12 metrics. So the metrics are shown here, and we use a rating system for 1 for fully comply, 0 for partially comply, and -1 for do not comply. I'm going to briefly go through and introduce each one of these metrics because beyond serving as a benchmark for alignment with democracy, it is also a very valuable framework for policymakers, decision makers, leaders, students as well, and academic to think about AI governance. So the first one is the endorsement and the first two, endorsement and implementation of the OECD and G20 AI principles. So this is one of the first global framework on ethical AI governance. It is endorsed by all of its member states, but it is also open to non-member countries. So we assess this by looking at its implementation as well. We look at the OECD website, which tracks implementation. We also look at government document for explicit reference of these principles. Additionally, we also recognize Canada, France, Korea, and Japan for their leading role in developing these principles and implementing them. And the next is the endorsement and implementation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is one of the most widely recognized, widely adopted legal framework that protects human rights. So, and it predates the rise of AI. And as we have anticipated, it is now the foundation to key AI debates and issues. To assess its implementation, we refer to Freedom House, which rate countries around the world whether they are free, partially free, or not free. Next is public participation in AI policy development and publicly available AI documents. Now, these are important. So what we look for is that in the development of AI policies, there should be established meaningful public participation. Now, this can look different across local contexts, but essentially they should be formal processes. They should also empower people, so not just enable, but empower people to actually participate, and that all members of public are adequately represented, and also that sufficient time is provided to ensure that the engagement is meaningful. We also look for documents on AI policies and practices from countries that are provided publicly so that they are accessible, that they are complete and accurate. Next is independent oversight. So the development and deployment of AI raises a lot of concerns related to accountability, to privacy data protection, fairness, transparency, and equity. And because of that, the need for an established independent agency to look over these issues is incredibly important. So typically they will be in the form of data protection agencies, human rights commissions, or AI ethic commissions. Next are the principles of fairness, accountability, transparency, rule of law, and fundamental rights. So there are many themes and principles in the topic of AI governance, but we identified these 5 as the most significant key goals for countries to address. So these principles are already often found in AI policy framework. They are also grounded in law. And what we do is we look for explicit mention or incorporation into AI governance from the countries or AI strategies. Next is algorithmic transparency. So this is one of the most significant policy issues today. And what this means is essentially that individuals have the right to know when decisions are being made about them by AI, and that there are mechanisms in place that empower people to challenge, to review, and to seek redress on these decisions. So currently there are 2 legal frameworks that provide such right. That is the EU General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, and the Council of Europe Convention 108 Plus. So countries that are covered or have signed these frameworks, they are obligated to provide these rights. And beyond that, we look for countries that have also enacted legal frameworks. I understand this is very high level. I was supposed to actually say that, yes, it is very high level, all these frameworks, and they are addressed for countries, but actually they are also, because we get a lot of questions from business leaders as well, and students who are studying in the realm of AI. How do we ensure ethical governance? So these frameworks are relevant as well. Next is the endorsement of the AI treaty. So last year, 2024, the Council of Europe enacted the Convention on AI and Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. This makes the world's first legally binding international treaty on AI. And so recognizing this significance, we added this as a new metric to our 2025 report. Next is the implementation of the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI. So currently, all UNESCO member states have already endorsed this framework. So next, we're looking at implementation, whether countries are implementing these recommendations. We look at government announcement, efforts from regional organizations, news articles, and NGO reports. And on top of that, we also address countries or look for countries that have completed some of these UNESCO tools that are designed to specifically to supplement the implementation of this framework. So two of them here are the readiness assessment methodology and the ethical impact assessment. These tools are actually very useful tool, not just for governments, but for decision makers, for leaders, to assess their current capacity, whether or not they're ready to deploy AI. And this is a way to help them launch implementation efforts. And last but not least is the endorsement of Global Privacy Assembly resolutions. So the GPA is a conference of data protection and privacy commissioners, and they have adopted several resolutions that are focused on AI. So we have the first one is AI ethics, AI accountability, facial recognition, and generative AI. So typically we look for national data protection agencies that have endorsed these resolutions because they're a good indicator of whether or not countries are committed to upholding these guardrails. So now that we've looked at the metrics, and then again using the rating system of 1 for fully comply, 0 for partially comply, and -1 for do not comply, here are the key findings for the CADIP index. So overall, out of all the countries, the top 5 are Japan, Canada, Korea, Netherlands, and UK, scoring from between 10.5 to 11.5 out of a maximum of 12 points. Next, when we look at tiered distributions, more than half of the countries assessed are within the middle to high range, whereas 45% of countries are in the middle low to low range. From a geographical perspective, what I want to point out here is that if we look at the countries that scored fairly strongly, which are the blues and the greens, and compared to the orange and yellow, which are the lower side, what I want to point out is that it's fairly distributed between north and south. And why I'm bringing this up is because there is often an assumption that the global south is lagging behind in terms of AI governance. But this index actually indicates that that is not necessarily the case. We see here that Latin America has scored fairly strongly, and on top of that, Saudi Arabia and South Africa also did fairly well. So looking at the specific metrics, the strongest area is the endorsement of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with 99% of countries have endorsed that declaration. However, when we look at the actual implementation, the protection of human rights, it still remains limited, with only 53% of countries rated as free by the Freedom House. In terms of transparency, we see that 66% of countries are doing well with ensuring that their documents are publicly available and accessible. We also see 61% of countries have endorsed the OECD AI principles. But when we come down to the implementation, it's still encouraging that 78% of countries have partially implemented the OECD principles, and 53% of countries have partially implemented the UNESCO recommendation. On the lower end, there are 66% of countries that have yet to endorse the AI treaty. Now, this is understandable. It was only enacted last year, but there are also 65% of countries that have yet to endorse any of the Global Privacy Assembly resolution. So based on the performance of these metrics, we can see that 53 to 99% of countries have fulfilled the endorsement of the OECD principles, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UNESCO recommendations, which is really good because all this signal that there is a strong global alignment when it comes to ethical AI values. We also see 40 to 45% of countries having fulfilled key metrics such as public participation, ensuring documents are public, independent oversight, key AI principles, and ensuring algorithmic transparency. So this is encouraging, but there is still room for improvement. However, only 5 to 15% of countries have implemented the OECD AI principles and the UNESCO recommendations. And as mentioned, the endorsement of AI treaty and the GPA resolution is also still behind. So this tells us that there needs to be greater focused efforts on addressing these gaps. So as mentioned earlier, CADIP, the center, provide expert guidance on AI policies to governments and international organizations. So a lot of it is based on these metrics and a key finding. And on top of that, we also refer to the Universal Guidelines for AI. So the Universal Guidelines for AI was introduced in 2018 at the Data Protection and Privacy Commissioner Conference. And essentially, the elements are taken from human rights and data protection law, as well as ethical frameworks. But the core of it is that these guidelines provide or covers individual rights and institutional obligations. And the essential goal is that it wants to provide more accountability and transparency in these AI systems, as well as ensure that people retain control over the technology. So based on the metrics and the Universal Guideline for AI, we have these general policy recommendations for this year in our work. So the first one is that naturally the adoption of the International AI Treaty. It is still significantly the world's first and only legally binding framework that is going to protect human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Next is clear red lines and prohibitions. So Christabel Randolph and Mark Rodenberg, which are our associate director and co-founder, they have written extensively about this challenge that we need to draw clear red lines, especially to prohibit AI systems that violates human rights. So on top of that, additionally, the Universal Guideline for AI also prohibits secret profiling and unitary scoring. Next is implementation and enforcement. So last year, we started seeing more and more countries and organizations beginning to move from the proposal stages to the enactment stages. So building on that positive momentum, we are urging decision makers and leaders to start advancing their principles into implementation and enforcement stages. Human oversight and human in the loop remains an essential element in the use of AI, especially when AI is being used in a high-stake or critical sector, such as those used in hiring processes or medical diagnosis, for example. It's important to have a person still in place to reduce the risk of serious harm. On top of that, there is also the termination obligation outlined in the Universal Guideline for AI, which requires a human to stay in the loop. So as mentioned, algorithmic transparency. This is still an important goal for us to strive for, that people need to have this right and are empowered to understand and seek, review, and challenge on decisions made by AI. And last but not least, we need AI liability framework. So AI is increasingly deployed across critical sector, affecting how we work, how we live, how we interact, and the harms associated with these systems is increasing, and they're well documented. So liability framework can help us address these types of harm both before and after the deployment of AI. So what it does is, apart from providing clear liability and accountability for deployers, developers, users, it can also serve as a strong incentive for AI actors to advance AI safely and responsibly. So to conclude, the guardrails that were reflected in these recommendations are imperative to ensure that we continue to protect fundamental rights, democracy, democratic values, and the rule of law in the progress of AI. And these recommendations can be found in this year's 2025 AIDV report, which is available and free to download from our website. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
So thank you, that was fantastic. So I was looking at who were your top 5, or some of your top countries. And here I'm like, for like, what might sound like a zinger, and so I don't mean to like be picky in that way. But one of the things that struck me was that Japan. Yeah, so I'll start again. So looking at your top 5 ranking, I saw that Japan was one of the top countries. I realize this is probably just one factor, but it was interesting. So I'm a business lawyer by day, and Japan stands out in my mind as one of the first countries to pass a national law, in essence granting the companies that build AI systems a right to freely train on the content of others without violation of copyright law. And since I represent a number of, let's say, like authors, publishers, content creators, in this country, right, there's a dispute ongoing. I think in many countries there are. And so from the point of view of content creators, they would view Japan as problematic because, right, all of their content has just been created and a kind of a green light for the developers of the models to do anything they want without accountability on that front. Do you have any comment, and do you have any comment on countries of your top 5 where maybe a particular factor like this one might have outsized weight for how you view a country in terms of its overall ranking?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I have to say, as a researcher, all these metrics, they're always tough because there's so many nuances. And when you talk about fundamental rights, democratic values, and the rule of law, well, apart from rule of law, there's a lot of nuances when it comes to assessing these performances. And that's why we always refer back to the 12 metrics. Actually, I'll just stop here. Is that clear enough to see? So we try to keep and just look at these 12 metrics. We don't just say yes, no, or partially. We do look at everything that they've published. A lot of our sources is news sources, government announcements, websites, so different kind of sources. But we try to look at not just whether or not, okay, they have endorsed it, but how are they implementing it? So we do look at what steps they're taking. We cannot go in too deep about but how deep are they going and how they're addressing it. That said, it's still a very comprehensive report. So yes, there are still going to be nuances, as you pointed out, very rightly so. One key one, for example, is people often ask why Saudi Arabia actually ranks pretty high. The thing is they do meet actually all these requirements. Of course, they score lower. In fact, they're the only country that has not endorsed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So there's still these things that are reflected in there. And the report goes deeper in terms of their country reports inside, which discuss these types of nuances. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Does this apply to countries' militaries?
Unfortunately, no. There are some mention of the military deployment of AI in the report on what countries' positions are when it comes to these discussions and where they are when you're using military use of AI. However, I don't know if you're familiar with these frameworks, but majority of AI regulations and frameworks actually does not include military use of AI. So typically, military use of AI is an exception outside of these frameworks. Sorry.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. There's so many different areas around AI ethics that are challenging, difficult conversations. And so I'm just going to try to zero in on one, which is the issue of transparency and particularly explainable AI. And I know there's a lot of very smart people trying to work on this issue, but it's still a very challenging issue because at the end of the day, even the developers may not understand how AI came up with a particular decision. And so I'm wondering from your standpoint, from your viewpoint, and from all the work that you've done with CAIDP, what are some of the leading thoughts on this issue of transparency from an explainable AI standpoint?
a lot of our work, you're right in saying that there is a lot of contested and very much debate topic and issues surrounding explainability. You know, there's a side where it's very technical. How do we explain these, you know, how the neural network works, how the parameters work, how the algorithm works. So there's a lot of that. And then there's the propriety issues as well. How much can we the companies want to reveal or not reveal. But at CIDP, we focus on the impact on human rights. So if AI is going to make a decision about me that I may not necessarily agree, but it's going to violate my human rights, it's going to decide whether or not I have economic opportunities, whether or not I get health care. These are big decisions. And so if we look back at product liability, right? If you cannot ensure that your product is going to perform accurately or do not violate human rights, in theory, it should not be in the market. So we want to make sure that these AI systems and the developers are kept accountable, that they can explain to a certain extent. You don't have to go into the details, like you don't have to understand how a car works, but you want to make sure that it's safe. You know, so to enable that people can still challenge, find out why was this decision made, at least to know the why and how you can challenge it meaningfully. So instead of saying, this decision was made, we can't do anything about it, this is not something we want to accept, because we should always understand why our rights are violated. I hope that helps.
Thank you for the talk. So you have the report. What's the next step? What is it that you want countries to do with this information?
Right, so great question. A lot. So one of the things is kind of what a lot of like UN does a lot is to keep countries accountable. They know that these metrics exist. We work a lot with governments. They are aware of the report. They are aware with the evaluation and the country ranking. So it's a kind of accountability system that they can see where they're ranked and what the metrics are, so they're very clear that at least meet some of these criteria, right? Ensuring that your citizens and people are able to participate in the development of your AI policy, even meaning that means a lot. And so one is accountability. The other one is there's still a lot of governance framework that are emerging. A lot of governments, organizations, companies are still developing their AI governance. And so this is also to provide them, as mentioned, a framework that they can start from to think about what are the things I need to consider when I want to ensure that my AI governance is ethical and is not going to violate any human rights. So this is a starting point. So the last one is that we also use this as our basis for providing recommendations. So we see where the gaps are and what are the key issues that we need to address in the coming years. So that's also where we use this for.
This is really interesting. It seems like the rule of law and government endorsement can't keep pace with the changes taking place in AI and the development. So I wonder if this is something that you have turned to enterprise, to the corporate world, so having an index, for instance, for OpenAI or Anthropic, because that might help address some of these issues before policymakers possibly can.
That is a great question. No, we actually are not focused on enterprises and organizations, but what we do is that I believe it's also partly the fact that we believe that the greater impact is going to come from government regulation. Yes, certain countries may be slower, but certain countries are taking steps in addressing these regulations and governance, and that would encompass both private and public sector. We do also do some litigation work. That's a small part of the center's work, where we have actually brought forth litigation, for example, a case on OpenAI to the FTC, talking about one of the key points is deceptive uses and also the data protection issues. So we do that as well. But yes, it is outpacing.
Hi, thanks. This has been very, very interesting discussion. One comment and then a question, I think. So I work for the U.S. Trade and Development Agency based in Roslyn, Virginia. So we do promotion of US technology and jobs overseas and developing markets. So as we think about how we can help US companies export AI technology, one thing that I, as an attorney, am thinking about is what are these markets capable of absorbing in terms of their ability to have all of these endorsements and principles implemented already. So I would very much like to link up with you because I have some ideas about where, how we can educate our business development team about some of the countries that we work in that are low and middle income that have gaps in some of these regulations that could potentially use some of our grant assistance. So that's just one comment. Question, I think, is more about whether you're seeing any correlation between the countries that are ranked highly on the index and their investments that they're making in, say, the private sector's development of AI. Are you seeing that countries that are very good about creating these guardrails for AI are also putting their dollars in the AI development for the private sector?
So in terms of investment, that is something that we specifically do not look at because we focus very much on the policy side. However, I have seen the numbers from different reports, and I am aware of some of the top countries. The US is actually the top countries in investment. I do know that, let's see, among these, Korea and UK are some of the top investors in AI, but not by much when compared to US, for example, and China. So in that sense, if I look at this list, just like eyeballing it, no, there's no really strong correlation in how much you invest in AI development with your regulation and ethical AI governance.
Yeah, I just have to follow up. I see the U.S. is not ranked highly on this list. Is there any, can you flag some reasons why the U.S. is not ranked highly and whether we are making progress towards achieving some of the items that were not ranked as highly on?
Sure. Okay, so I'm seeing, actually, I wonder if it's better if I just look here. So I think, right, I see, actually, I wouldn't say it's not high. It's at 8.5, which is actually pretty solid. So some of it, Q2, is the implementation of the OECD AI principles, for example. We're not seeing a whole lot, and I think that is kind of explainable given the, I wouldn't say but lack of regulations in general. In the US, we only have one comprehensive federal framework at the moment, which is the NIST AI Risk Assessment Management, and that's about it. We used to have an executive order, but that's been scrapped. So in terms of that, it's understandable that there's less in terms of AI governance. And the US have endorsed, I'm trying to see what Q10 is, let's see, but specifically, but I would say the weakness in US when it comes to these ranking would be down to the lack of governance regulations that are emerging. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. So I'll ask a question. So in terms of translating these into human rights outcomes, do you think each of these sort of different dimensions is equally important, or is there some that countries should be emphasizing more than others?
In terms of the metrics?
Yeah.
It's almost like asking a parent who their favorite child is. It's tough because they're all very important metrics to meet, and some of them they do overlap, like the principles, there are overlaps. So if you do implement the OECD AI principles, you're very likely to have number 8 as well, so having those incorporated in your AI documents. But then there's some like public participation, you really need to establish those processes and have them available documents. I can't really say that there's one specific, like, if you can't do anything, this is what you need to do. Ideally, we would like you to the countries to cover these. Yeah. Yes.
Earlier in this conference, I think I saw a slide that said there was an executive order from Trump in his first term, and then Biden gave a different executive order, and I think Trump rescinded that executive order. I think it was something along the lines of maybe trying to add more safety into AI, and I think Trump might have rescinded that to allow us to innovation to thrive, if you will, but taking off the guardrails. I don't know if you have more details on that, if you are familiar with that, if you could comment on that.
I am somewhat familiar. So, yes, there's been a lot of changes between those three terms. Now, we always point back to the fact that when Biden wrote, or when he signed his executive order, that executive order was actually built off of Trump's executive order. So, in terms of alignment and consistency, there is a consistency that's going through that. So, yes, there were some guardrails that were rescinded when that Biden's executive order was canceled, and now there's a greater focus on advancing innovation and adoption. The lack of guardrail is concerning, but we're trying to also, I'm like pulling on, trying to focus that there is still that positive alignment that is still going through, like the values and the principles are still there. That's not a satisfactory answer, I know, but it is where we are at. Any other questions? Do we have time?
I think we have time for one more.
Go ahead.
Thanks. A great presentation. Just to follow up the question about which ones are more important, doesn't seem like, for example, number one and number two, number one is endorsing and two is actually implementing. Doesn't it seem like two would have more weight? It's like saying, will you follow the law and actually following the law? I mean, actions speak louder than words, that type thing.
No, I agree. That is probably one way to look at it. But a lot of times, there are still a lot of countries that have not endorsed the OECD AI principle, which is why it is still there, that we're encouraging countries or urging them to endorse those principles, at least to start with signaling their commitment to it, and then followed by the implementation. So for a while, the UNESCO recommendation, we were also tracking endorsement, but as of now, we have got all member states have endorsed it, so then we've shifted to solely focusing on its implementation. So we're still at the stage where we're still pushing for more endorsement, just to signal that commitment and awareness of these principles.
Okay, so I think we're at time. Thanks very much, and a round of applause.